3 days before the worst flood in his village's history, one old man told everyone to leave. No warning system told him. No phone alert, no weather report. Just decades of watching the sky, and nobody believed him until the water was already at their doors. This is the story of Elias, the villager everyone called crazy, until the one night his warning saved an entire town. Elias had lived beside the river his entire life, in a small farming village nestled in a valley between two mountains. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't educated in meteorology. But he had spent over 60 years watching the same river, the same clouds, the same patterns repeating themselves season after season. The younger villagers mostly ignored him, and the ones who didn't quietly laughed behind his back. He was the old man who talked to birds, who smelled the air before deciding whether to plant crops, who once refused to leave his house for 2 days because, in his words, the ants were moving wrong. Here's something most people don't know. Animals genuinely can sense changes in atmospheric pressure long before humans do, often reacting to storms and floods hours or even days in advance. Elias didn't need a scientific term for it. He'd simply learned, through decades of quiet observation, to trust what the world around him was already trying to say. It started with the river's color, subtly shifting from clear to a murky brown, days before any rain had even fallen in the village itself. Elias explained to anyone who would listen that this meant heavy rainfall was already happening much further upstream, in the mountains, even if their own skies looked completely clear. Fact: rivers often carry warning signs of flooding long before the flood itself arrives locally, because water travels downstream from rainfall that may have happened miles away, sometimes over a full day earlier. Then came the birds. Elias noticed flocks leaving the lower valley earlier than usual, gathering instead on higher ground near the hillside. Most villagers assumed it was simply the season changing. Elias knew better. He'd seen this pattern exactly once before, decades earlier, right before the flood of his childhood that had swept away half the village center. Elias went to the village council 3 days before the flood, urging them to warn families near the riverbank to move their belongings to higher ground, at the very least. The council thanked him politely, then did nothing. To them, the sky was clear, the forecast from the regional radio predicted only light rain, and Elias's reputation as the strange old man made his warning easy to dismiss. Fact: even today, flash floods remain one of the most underestimated natural disasters, largely because they can occur even in areas that received little to no rainfall themselves, simply due to runoff traveling in from higher elevation, often catching entire communities by surprise. Elias didn't argue further. Instead, he quietly began going door to door himself, speaking directly to the families living closest to the river. On the third night, the rain that had been falling for days in the distant mountains finally reached its breaking point. Upstream dams and natural terrain could no longer hold the volume of water building up, and the river began rising at a speed the village had never recorded in its written history. By the time the water reached the village center, it had risen over 2 meters in less than 4 hours. Fact: flash floods can rise from a calm, normal water level to a life-threatening flood in under 6 hours, which is why early warning, even informal warning based on close observation, often matters more than the flood's actual size. Because of Elias's door-to-door warnings, 23 families along the riverbank had already moved their essential belongings, livestock, and most importantly, themselves to higher ground before the water ever arrived. Not everyone listened, even that night. A handful of families, still doubtful, delayed leaving until the water was already at their doorsteps, forcing a chaotic, dangerous evacuation in the dark, guided only by Elias and a few younger villagers carrying lanterns through rising water. By early morning, when the flood finally peaked, homes near the lowest part of the village were completely submerged. But every single person in the village had made it to higher ground alive. Not one life was lost that night, in a flood that historical records show had killed dozens in the same village generations before. In the weeks that followed, government disaster teams arrived to study the flood, confirming what Elias had read purely through decades of quiet observation. An unusually intense storm system had stalled directly over the mountains upstream, dropping an extraordinary amount of rainfall in a very short, concentrated period. The same council that had dismissed him days earlier now asked him to help